This video is on the road about resetting the fuel and ignition map in the engine control module. Microcontroller in the engine module has a lookup table of operating values for fuel and ignition. And there was a problem with that, and I did something without realizing it that was very bad. But I want you to see one of the results of this, and this is hot startup. But look at the odometer. 305,000 miles on this 4.3 V6. But I want to show you the hot restart. Watch how fast this thing fires off. Poof.
With certain health conditions.
Almost immediate light off and jumps right up to idle speed. And now back in the house after picking up the latest and generally worthless edition of the IEEE Spectrum, which usually ends up in a garbage can. From the post office, we're back to explain to you about an obscure little paragraph in this factory GM manual from my 95S10 about control module learning. It's very easy to go through this book and miss this, and I had missed this problem, I hate to admit it, but for several years. And I can sit as an engineer and I can engineer and develop and manufacture that control module. I know everything that's inside of it, and I still miss this. Very important before working on a vehicle, get the factory manual, doesn't matter how much it costs, and read these basic descriptions of all the systems and the operations. Don't just jump into the details of the diagnosis charts or the fault codes, but make sure you understand the basic operation. The short story is, I now have a truck that literally runs like new. And I was thinking yesterday and last night that the engine was probably failed and I was probably going to have to change the engine. It didn't run worth a hoot. And it didn't run worth a hoot because of fouled spark plugs as a result of leaking valve guide seals. I replaced the seals and cleaned the plugs, and it ran like crap. And this truck for years has had almost no acceleration in third gear and torque converter lockup. Now it does. And I'm telling you, it runs like a new vehicle at 305,000. The mistake I'd made without realizing it, because I'm from the ignition points era where there's no computer and this doesn't apply, but I had made the mistake this time recently of having to replace bearings in the alternator and the idlers for the accessory belt. Of course, I had unhooked a battery to work on the alternator. Reconnected the battery, ran like crap, misfiring, no power. Found a fouled spark plug on number 5, cleaned all the plugs, put it back in, still ran like crap. Ran like better crap, but still like crap. What's wrong here? No power, bad misfire, cold, ran poor, hot. Going through this in my mind, it feels like injectors leaking down overnight, but see, I'd replaced the throttle body not too long ago with a new one. And I've not seen evidence of injector leak down. This is what the old carburetors would do when the engine was shut off hot and the carbs were leaky. It would, especially Chrysler products with the thermo junk, the heat soak from the engine would dump the fuel in the manifold and the thing wouldn't start the next day. I was down to possibly bad piston rings, but that didn't seem likely because I changed valve guide seals and cleared up a couple cylinders. And last night it hit me what I had been doing wrong. I had disconnected the battery and reconnected it on top of a fouled spark plug. And the computer learned bad operating data. In this old control module, what happens is that the computer has a lookup table, a group of memory locations where it stores operating information as far as fuel, pulse, fuel injector pulse timings and widths, and ignition timing and advance and all that stuff. That and some basic constraints on injector pulse widths and timing is what it uses in open loop, or when the engine is cold, both cold engine and cold O2 sensor. Now the engine can operate in a mode where the O2 sensor is hot, but the coolant isn't. And then there's full hot. Without information from the O2 sensor, the controller has to fall back on this map of operating parameters. And I had told it, without realizing it when I reconnected the battery, to learn again on top of 3 fouled spark plugs and 1 fouled so badly the cylinder didn't want to run. I caught this last night after going through everything possible and coming up with nothing as far as the fuel system and the engine, and then it hit me what I'd done wrong. So this morning I went out and I had opened the driver's door, pulled the access panel off the fuse block, and pulled fuses 9 and 10, marked ECM battery and ECM ignition, marked with the purple. It's not necessary to disconnect the battery to reset the ECM. Pulling those fuses does the same thing. But I pulled the fuses and went back in the house for 10 minutes to make sure that the ECM, the capacitors in the ECM discharge and take the power off the controller. Then when the controller does a complete restart, it'll go through a routine to relearn. And that's covered in this paragraph that's hiding up here in the front of the book in drivability and emissions. The control module has a learning ability, allows to make corrections for variations in fuel system to improve drivability. The learning process, if the battery is disconnected to clear the diagnostic trouble codes or for other repairs, the learning process resets and begins. A change may be noted in the vehicle's performance. To teach the vehicle, make sure the engine is at operating temperature, so on and so forth. I went back out and put the fuses back in and started the engine cold at about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And immediately the idle was better. Well, of course, I cleaned the spark plugs, but it was better than the day before I reset the controller. And about a minute in, I heard the controller stepping through fuel output because there were 3 discrete steps in engine RPM, a big step, and then a few seconds, and it stepped up again, and then a smaller step. And the warm-up process in the engine can't do that. That's the controller changing the pulse widths on the injectors to see what effect that has on RPM. Even though the O2 sensor isn't working, the controller can change the fuel output by changing the injector pulse widths. And if the fuel is lean, increasing the injector pulse widths causes more fuel in the engine and the speed will pick up, so it can vary the fuel flow effectively and sense what effect that has on the engine speed. It did that, and the engine settled down, and up on full hot, it ran like a new one. Before, when we get out with the engine running, shut off and restart, there were fuel smells getting to be pretty bad, which is why I thought maybe there was a problem with the throttle body, but it's new, or close to new, and no fuel leaks. All that's gone. I stopped after a trip to teach the module. It ran beautifully. I now have power even in torque converter lockup 3rd gear. It'll now accelerate where it wouldn't before. Before, in 3rd gear or lockup, you step on the gas, nothing happened. But now the fuel smells are gone. So the trick here is that, especially after dealing with things like bad spark plugs, make sure to pull those fuses, let the controller relearn. It made a difference between an old junk vehicle and literally running like a new one. And an important point, this engine was running extremely poorly, but it was not setting any codes, so it didn't see anything broken. But this, it turned out to be fouled spark plugs, and having learned several times in the past, because I've disconnected the battery previously when it wasn't running right, it had learned bad data. And it only knows so much control. It can't sense that it's been given bad data. So there's the trick for resetting the ECM.